Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the International Affairs Forum at Northwestern Michigan College. So glad to have you all here with us. And so close on the heels of our inaugural IAF Gala last week at the Hagerty Center. And I can attest that this group, many in this group, you clean up very, very well. All your finery, you were great. We appreciate all that support. We heard from inspiring student speakers there who have been propelled by their experiences at IAF, and we were challenged by our thought-provoking keynote speaker, the Honorable Peter Meyer, former U.S. representative and veteran. And we'll be looking forward to our next gala, and we thank you for all that support last week. If we haven't met, my name is Alex Tank, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the International Affairs Forum. And right now I'd like to take a moment to greet everyone joining us online, including our satellite partners in Leland at the Old Art Building and our friends from the Zonta Club of Rogers City at the Presque Isle District Library. And you can give them a wave of that camera over there. And these folks help us make a great impact across northern Michigan. We're going right across the fingers there. If we engage any satellite partners from the UP, then I'd do the two-handed thing. Did I get it right? Which is right? I don't know. Well, we're looking forward to sharing this programming further and further across the state, and you're all part of that with your support. All right. Also like to take this time to thank our business community members, that's Century LLC, Desmond Liggett Wealth Advisors, Higher Grounds Coffee, Rivard T. and Wheatley Group with Baird Private Wealth Management, Nicolay National Bank, Paul M. Schmuckel, and two of our newest supporters, Jason C. Piedmont with JP Morgan Wealth Management and Traverse City Tourism. So a big round of applause for them. That is very important support from our business community. And I want to sincerely thank all of the IAF members in the audience. You really are the core of our support, and you make this program happen year after year, now in our 32nd season. You make this community educational asset live and thrive, so thank you. You deserve more applause, but you can applaud all night. Yeah. My final plug, I won't say final plug, but we are looking to top 450 members this season. Last year we topped out at 453 members. So if you can help us get there by spreading the word, by bringing friends, many of you have brought friends tonight, we sincerely appreciate that sharing about what we're doing. It's truly vital. So a quick reminder here to silence mobile devices, and here's how we'll run this evening's program. I'll be back up for the Q&A session after our moderated conversation. And the Q&A option for everyone in person or online is to email your questions to iaf@nmc.edu. And that is the preferred method. For everyone online, you can also submit questions via the Zoom Q&A function during any point in the program. Last method for the audience here, you can flag down one of our volunteers. We've got some students here from the IAF student leadership team, and they will be circulating towards the end of the moderated conversation with some cards and pens. And we appreciate that good penmanship and those concise questions. Okay, now to introduce our moderator and our guest speaker for this evening. First, a man we know very well and we love just as well, Major General Mike Leonard is the co-chair of the International Affairs Forum Advisory Board. Sure. Mike retired from the Marine Corps after 37 years of service in 2010. During that time, he held 13 separate commands and participated in military operations in Panama, Kuwait, Iraq, where he led 5,000 Marines and sailors during the initial invasion of Iraq in 2003. He ran the Cuban and Haitian migrant camps during Operation Sea Signal in Guantanamo and returned there in 2002 as the Joint Task Force Commander responsible for securing the detainees transferred from the Afghan conflict. In 2010, he was honored with the Peacemaker Award by the National Conflict Resolution Center for his work defending human rights at the Guantanamo detention facility, where his experience was documented in Karen Greenberg's book, The Least Worst Place. He holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of Maryland, earned while he attended the Naval War College. Major General Mike Leonard. And now our guest speaker for this evening, Christopher Preble is a senior fellow and director of the Reimagining US Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center and the founding co-host of the Net Assessment podcast. You all should check it out. It's great listening and great learning. He is the author of 4 books, including Peace, War, and Liberty, Understanding U.S. Foreign Policy, and The Power Problem, How American Military Dominance Makes Us Less Safe, Less Prosperous, and Less Free. He has also worked at the Atlantic Council and the Cato Institute and has taught at the University of California, Washington Center, Temple University, and St. Cloud State. Preble earned a PhD in history from Temple University. We are honored to have them with us, so please give a warm International Affairs Forum welcome to Chris Preble and Mike Leonard.
I can't see any of you right now. I can't see any of you right now. There could be 500 people in the audience right now, Mike. There are at least 500 people because I can't see.
Yeah. Since you can't see anybody, there's about 4,200 people in this audience today.
The number's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, but who's counting? Well, Chris, welcome to Traverse City. We had an opportunity to drive up the old Mission Peninsula today and show him a little bit of the color. I have to tell you that, it's a pleasure to have you here, and it's a pleasure to show off our great community. So I'm going to get right to the first question.
All right.
All right. Senior military leaders and diplomats have a responsibility to speak truth to power. So do you think that guys like me have failed in our responsibility to ask policy leaders the critical question, what does the U.S. do after the shooting stops?
Well, thanks, Mike. So first of all, I do want to thank everyone for this opportunity. Thank you, Mike, for showing me around Traverse City, and we went up the peninsula there and saw the color was just absolutely beautiful. And thanks to Alex Tank for everything and everyone here for welcoming me. Honestly, Mike, I don't think that we, the American people, should hold folks like you responsible for not asking questions like that. When you're given an order, if it's a lawful order, we should talk about that, but if it's a lawful order, you have a responsibility to obey it. I hold all of us, the American people, responsible for not holding our civilian leaders accountable, for not asking those questions. It's really easy. The United States of America has an incredible capability to use force, but as I think we've learned over the last 25 years or so, that doesn't always solve problems. A lot of times it creates new ones. And so we certainly have enough experience from these conflicts to ask this question, and I think ultimately it is the responsibility of every American to ask these questions, not the folks in uniform.
Okay. Well, I still think we probably ought to ask the questions, but I appreciate you broadening the audience so that more people are asking. We've had a lot of U.S. interventions into foreign countries, and they always seem to start with really good intentions and high expectations for success. So why do you think the results have so often been different from those expectations? And what should, probably the most important question is, what should policymakers do before we make a decision to commit our blood and treasure to these expeditions?
So first and foremost, I think we do have to ask the question of what comes after. You started with the right question, because I don't think we can presume that taking an action is going to produce a better result. Sometimes not acting is the right thing to do. So first and foremost, but you understand that among policymakers, there's an action bias. There's a desire to do something, to take action, because, well, that's what they're there for. They feel like, and the fact is that I think we we've seen enough times where unintended consequences caused by good intentions are, that we just have to keep those in mind. And I also say, again, that the military is a blunt instrument. It's an exquisite instrument, but yet it's blunt at the same time. And there's only so many things that we can reasonably expect the military to accomplish, and I think we need to be very careful about defining those missions narrowly and being clear about what other, what other responsibilities throughout the federal government and throughout society to support those efforts. And it's not just on the backs of the troops.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris. Now, there's a sign here on that talks about the Better Order Project. So, Chris, why don't you tell us about it?
Sure. So I was very fortunate to be asked by the Quincy Institute to be a part of a project that they ran over the last couple of years called the Better Order Project. On the screen there, you can see the participants in this from so many different places around the world, and it was just really an honor for me to be a part of it. What they set out to do in this project is to recognize that many of the norms and standards, and even, yes, international law that were established, with the founding of the UN after the end of the Second World War, the world has changed so much since then, and therefore we need to adapt and change that order to reflect the realities. The distribution of power is just completely different. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I wanted to just give a shout out to everyone involved in this project. Quincy is one of the organizations that's responsible for me being here. And I think there might be one other slide, Alex, after this one. Yeah, there we go. I'm not going to get into the details of this report because we have so many other great questions that Mike has teed up. But you can see in this report that there were sort of 3 different baskets or pillars of work that they did. One having to do on the use of force, another having to do with dealing with transnational threats like climate change and pandemic disease, and then lastly a section on regional disorder, focused especially on Europe and the Middle East. I highly commend it. Actually, part of the reason why I'm carrying around a hard copy is there's a slightly newer version that's online, and that's the one you should go check out. The website, I think, is we had it on the first slide there. It's just Better Order Project. If you Google that or punch that in your favorite browser, it'll pop up. There it is, right there, betterorderproject.org. Really interesting work, and again, I'm really grateful to them for just including me. It was really an honor to be a part of it.
Well, thank you, Chris. Now, just about every speaker we have, if they have passed through China, the topic of China comes up. We had David Shambaugh here last month. He gave a marvelous talk about it, but you know a little bit about China, a lot about China. So I'm going to ask you the question there, Chris. In a multipolar world, China is emerging as a dominant, if not the dominant player. So how would you recommend that U.S. leaders address China's rising military and economic clout? So
it is true that today it seems like China is the answer to every question. And one of the ways that I approach it is that if something is worth doing, we should be doing it for our own purposes, not to compete with China. And yet, you can drum up support in Washington, D.C. for any project you can imagine if you say, but China, or but the Chinese are doing it. And on the one hand, I mean, just because they're doing it doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do, or that, so that's one thing. It's just like, But I think you teed this up correctly. We are living in this world. It is a multipolar world. It's becoming more multipolar, which is to say there are more capable actors. Countries have agency. I think from a Chinese perspective, they're not emerging as a great power. They would argue that they're re-emerging or returning to their formerly great power status. And ultimately, I think this is going to be a case where we're going to have to learn to coexist. Now, not that there aren't going to be points of tension, and there absolutely are, and the military, there are potential for military conflict over things like the South China Sea and Taiwan. There are human rights questions in terms of the treatment of the Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities, Tibet. And then there's the economic challenge and things like theft of intellectual property or things like that. We all need to take that seriously. But at the end of the day, you know, we live on a planet of 8 billion people, and we're about 340 million. They're 1.3 billion or so. We're going to have to figure out a way to live together. And ultimately, I think, to solve some problems that neither one of us can solve by ourselves, certainly. And so, to me, you know, there are parallels. I'm a historian of the Cold War. There are parallels to the Cold War. We might remember that one of the more dangerous periods in the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, and that was one of those critical moments where both the leaders in Moscow and President Kennedy and people around him in Washington sort of stared at the abyss and said, we need to figure out a way to step back from this. We haven't had such an incident with Beijing. I hope that it doesn't come to that. I hope we don't need such an incident for us to come to grips with the fact that we need to have a dialogue. We need to learn how to respect each other's red lines. But part of the reason, I think, why there's so much loose talk around competition is precisely because we haven't had such a sort of crisis or focus, a period to sort of focus our attention. So I'd like to believe we've learned from the past and we can adapt and not wait for that crisis to emerge.
Well, thank you, Chris. I'm going to switch gears a little bit because NMC has actually a very robust international relations program. We send young students overseas. We expose them to the opportunities to find out how other cultures live, and we've seen many of our great students go on to other colleges with a view towards getting into international relations and possibly even becoming diplomats. And yet at the same time, we've seen quite a bit of turmoil in the U.S. Department of State. So I'm going to ask this question for the benefit of our students out there and our future ambassadors and diplomats. What do we need? Is our system, let me put it a different way, is our system for building diplomats flawed?
I think our system for recruiting and training diplomats is flawed. There's a long answer to this question. I think it's worth taking a little bit of time on it. First and foremost, you and I both served in the military. We both knew how to get into the military. There are advertisements. They sponsor NASCAR cars. I mean, we know that the military is an option. I have to tell you that I taught U.S. foreign policy for about 11 years with the University of California, Washington Center, and these are a lot of students who are very interested in foreign policy, and honestly, many of them had never even considered the notion of becoming a diplomat, becoming a foreign service officer. So I think partly it's a function of how we go about recruiting, and that unfortunately has gotten worse over the last few years. The number of people, the way that the State Department goes about recruiting has fallen on a smaller and smaller number of people trying to recruit, and that's a problem. So we need to broaden the base of people that are even introduced to the notion of being a diplomat. But I think the problem even goes deeper than that, because I think most people don't really understand, most Americans don't really understand what diplomats do. My joke is that they think diplomats are the people who take over after the war is won, right? They're sort of like, folding up the peace treaty after it's been signed. Of course, that's not what diplomacy is about. Diplomacy is about identifying areas of common interest, avoiding conflict. I mean, the greatest stories are the wars that never happened in the first place. And I think ultimately this is what is a challenge for diplomacy. My colleague Evan Cooper at Stimson has a project on asking diplomats, career foreign service officers, to tell a few stories from their career, success stories, and to do so in it's a very casual sort of, fireside chat sort of thing. We just need better stories. People have to understand what diplomacy is about and how diplomats go about their work. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for people in the creative arts to tell better stories. and also for people to just have an open mind and be broad-minded about it. If you care about international relations, if you want to be involved, there are lots of ways to do it that don't involve wearing a uniform. And again, you and I understand what that's like, but I think there are many, many opportunities out there for young people.
Well, thank you, Chris. I'm going to kind of keep on this topic of students. Colleges and universities across the country are reporting a drop in foreign student enrollment. And what needs to change to become a magnet for the world's talent rather than have them go someplace else? And do we need, I didn't know that was funny, but okay. Do we need to change, that might have been funny, I don't know. Do we need to change the rules to make it easier to keep them after they graduate?
So we know why people have traditionally wanted to come to the United States is because we have had, and I think still continue to have, some of the best institutions of higher learning in the world. But like many of the other things that we took for granted as one of our sort of, unique advantages, sort of our birthright, it turns out there's competition out there, and that there are other universities around the world that are also doing very good work. And so I think, one of the messages that we should send to people is that they are actually welcome to come here and welcome to study here. And I think we're sending a different message. The Trump administration is sending a different message in terms of, the way that they have. Yeah, well, we're not really. Yeah, I appreciate the applause, but you understand what I mean in terms of this process of encouraging people to want to come here and study. We took it for granted, and I think what's happened over the last 6 or 8 months reminds us that we can't take it for granted. But let me say another thing that relates to the second part of your question, which is, it's true that a lot of the folks who come to the United States to learn and to study and to be trained in their careers, they choose to stay here. They don't want to go back home. And I do think there's an important conversation to be had about brain drain, about what the risks are to the places where they're leaving and whether or not, this is contributing to problems, other problems. At the end of the day, for me, it's a broader question than the question of education. People who say to me, aren't you worried that too many people want to come to the United States for everything, not just education, but for jobs and whatever? And I say, no, I'm worried when people don't want to come here. And that's what I'm afraid is happening.
2 points on that, Chris. I heard a statistic today that of the top 10 companies in the United States, 4 of them are led by individuals who immigrated to this country.
Right.
And the other thought that I just throw out to you is that, and this is for everybody here, it's a question for them, not for you as much, but how would you like to be living in a country where people weren't trying their best to get into?
Right. Exactly. In the Cold War, of course, the Soviet Union built walls to keep people in, and the irony of us building walls to keep people out, I think, is it's ironic a little bit.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. You've talked a bit I've listened to a lot of your talks before, and you've talked about spending more money on our military. And the question, I guess, for you is, does spending more money make us more secure, or does it make it more likely for our elected leaders to use military power in inappropriate situations?
Well, certainly, I believe that we need a military, and a strong one, and a capable one. I do not believe that we need a $1 trillion military approaching, it'll probably be $1.5 trillion by the end of this decade. That's real money even in Washington, D.C. And I do think that having this much military power at the disposal of a single person, because that's really how it functions now, and that was not the intention of the founders, is a problem. I think it creates the conditions that you teed up at the very beginning of this conversation, is that, well, I'm going to use this instrument, this hammer that I have, and I'm not going to worry about the consequences so much, and that's a concern. When the founders, when the founders crafted the Constitution, they were very clear about why they vested the war powers in the Congress and not in the executive branch. What they never could have imagined, and so they would be shocked to learn that the Congress would not stand up for its authority. We've had several war powers resolutions votes recently, including one just a couple weeks ago about Venezuela, which failed on a mostly party line vote. That would have shocked them. They would have imagined more institutional pride, and that would have shocked them. What would have shocked them more was knowing that the President of the United States would have at his disposal this instrument at his disposal, extant. Because remember, the Constitution calls for the raising of an army and the maintaining of a navy. They didn't expect there to be a standing military. If you go to war, then you raise a military to fight that war. And that part they just never could have imagined. Now, granted, so much has changed over 250 years. So it's not so surprising that we have this situation, but it seems to me that precisely because the old system for constraining the use of force has broken down is why it's incumbent upon all of us to insist on asking these hard questions before we resort to force. Because Congress, unfortunately, is not doing it. I think it ultimately falls on all of us.
Okay, well, thanks, Chris. When I agreed to moderate, Alex always lets me ask one dumb question each time, so I'm just going to let everybody know ahead of time. This one's it. We have what I would describe right now as transactional foreign policy. So the lines between our allies and our adversaries are more poorly defined than they've been in the past. So, Chris, why are allies important?
So, alliances, we start with like an alliance between two or more countries. Those are created because the parties to that alliance see a mutual benefit, right? And I think that one of the challenges of the last several years, and I think President Trump has tapped into this, is a sense that the alliances that were created after the end of the Second World War, like NATO, or expanded after the end of the Cold War, that the alliances themselves sort of became an end as opposed to a means to an end. So our team at Stimson is asking a very simple question: are our alliances fit for purpose, right? What is that purpose? Where did it come from? And has that purpose changed? Among those, we have many allies. It's hard to count even. And so actually one of the things we're doing in this project is showing on a map who our allies are and how do we determine who an ally is or a strategic partner, and where does it come from? Is it a treaty that's ratified by the Senate, or is it an executive agreement that was negotiated between a president and a chief head of state? There are all kinds of different ways to measure this. At the end of the day, I do believe that having allies who share certain common interests with us is an asset to the United States. What concerns me is that our interests are not perfectly aligned. And so we have to be aware of where our interests diverge. And when we have two or more allies who themselves are adversaries, what does that do to us? What kind of position does that put us in? And that's why ultimately we shouldn't think of alliances as an arithmetic function, right? The more allies we have, the better it is. No, the critical question is, how does this serve both parties' interests? What can we do to make sure that it's serving those interests? And what should we do if it's not serving those interests?
Okay. You've said that America first is a dangerous phrase. Why is that?
You know, I read that question and did I say that? Did I say that? Because, candidly, what president wouldn't say, I am here to put America's interests first? Like, what president would go out and say, actually, my purpose in being here is not primarily the security, prosperity, freedom of the American people, but something else, right? So the question is, it's almost like, why is this so shocking? Now, part of the reason is because of President Trump's sort of manner and his mannerisms and his tendency to make exaggerated, what is it he said? 25,000 people have been saved by the strikes on the Venezuelan boats. That was the number that he threw out yesterday.
Yeah, I saw that.
I don't think that's right. Anyway, so part of the problem, it seems to me, is the association with this phrase with President Trump. And also, we have to remember there was an America First committee prior to the Second World War. That ended badly as well, and so sort of recognizing the history of this. But at the end of the day, I do think that leaders, whether it's President Trump or whoever comes after him, has to make a case for a foreign policy that the American people believe does serve our interest. Now, here's where I think President Trump gets it wrong, and I think many of his supporters, is a sense that we can only do better when others are doing worse, that this is a zero-sum game. This also speaks to the transactionalism, right? I don't think that's true. I think that, in fact, the United States has done better, even as the rest of the world has been doing better too. And I think the evidence is overwhelming. So trying to get away from this frame of reference that says this is a zero-sum game, the only way that America is first is if putting everyone second or last, that's the part I don't agree with. I think we can advance our interests and we can be forthright about it, but not presume that the only way that we can advance is at the expense of everyone else.
Okay. I'm going to anticipate this question from the audience because I overheard some conversations that you had. And, you know, the administration has directed steep cuts in foreign aid. So, Chris, what are the long-term impacts, both to developing countries, to our influence in those countries? Are other nations taking our place? And by the way, putting all that reduction in foreign aid aside, forget about Argentina, okay? We got it. That's an outlier.
Fair enough.
That's an outlier.
Yeah.
So, is this current situation a good thing, a bad thing, or just a thing?
I do think that the Trump administration's decision to disband USAID and to sort of single out U.S. foreign aid, it's going to be hard to replace that, and the U.S. federal government, let me be clear, is not going to be replacing that anytime soon. I'm afraid there is not significant political will to recreate USAID as it existed before this year. But having said all that, I do think that, first of all, Americans are extraordinarily generous people, but the evidence on this is overwhelming. And there are many, many different ways that the United States and the American people are serving, you know, the interests of humanity, not just here in the United States, but globally. You know, we talked about the program PEPFAR that President Bush started, which was extraordinarily successful to deal with AIDS in Africa. But another organization that deserves a lot of credit is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in terms of malaria. Their work in Africa was extraordinary. And so we have many different ways to think about this. And I think that the tendency to sort of focus on what the U.S. federal government does may be a mistake. My colleagues, I've already mentioned Devin Cooper once, I'll mention him again. He and another colleague of mine, Alessandro Perry, they wrote a paper for Stimson just very recently, looking out 10 years and trying to imagine 4 different scenarios for aid based on the cuts that the Trump administration just made. And I think it's useful to go through these scenario exercises to imagine, like, what policies are practical that we can put in place, given President Trump and those around him their hostility to aid. What are the alternatives? Who might step up in place of the United States? And can we imagine a future 10 years down the road that is not so bleak as it looks right now? So I highly commend the paper. It's very well done.
Yeah. Many of you probably didn't have an opportunity to dig really deeply into Chris's bio, but he's made quite a study of base closures at a certain point in his illustrious career. So I'm going to ask you a question about some of the things that we've heard about base openings and closures. The president has stated he wants to reopen a base in Afghanistan, return to Panama, take over Greenland. Should we give these statements any credence? And conversely, what do you think about Qatar having a base in Idaho?
Yeah, the story about the Qataris having a base in Idaho, that caught my attention, the attention of our team at Stimson. We all got a chuckle out of that. The follow-up story was, sorry, I can't even say this without cracking up. It's just hilarious, that the topography of Idaho was a lot like Qatar, and so that was very useful for learning how to train, how to fly an F-15. Anyway, I'll just let that sit there for a minute. It is true that we do have, this is not unique. The Qataris are not the only ones that have a training arrangement. We have other countries that are training in the United States, so it's not unprecedented. Back to the other question about, you know, there's that old saying, do you take President Trump literally or do you take him seriously? And I think, you know, there are moments in time when he's demonstrated a sort of a determination, sort of a stubbornness that we can't discount. So it's possible that he's serious about Greenland. It's possible that he's serious about Panama. I can't come up with any reasonable explanation for why the United States would want another base in Afghanistan. Truly, I can't come up with one. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. You know, let's start with it. We still don't have any diplomatic relations with the Taliban, the leaders of Afghanistan, and that's for understandable reasons. They have a horrible human rights record. But if we wanted to have some sort of dialogue of any kind, then we would start with that. We would start with restoring of some kind of relationship. That's not on the cards. And so do we actually think that they're going to just tolerate us plopping back down into this base? It's just absurd. Anyhow, you see, I know I'm competing with David Sedaris, so I'm making some funny comments here. It's not my material. It's somebody else's material. You get that. But I do think that one of the flaws that this sort of talk reveals in the way that it's not unique to President Trump is we should not think of the U.S. presence globally as bigger is better. In more places is necessarily better. Yeah. Once again, the question is, for what purpose? Why? Why is it that we need a military facility in this particular location? What is it that we cannot achieve without securing this particular place? And I think those, when you scrutinize each of these decisions on a case-by-case basis, they don't hold up to scrutiny.
Well, you talked a bit about Afghanistan. We'll continue on a little there. You know, it's been called the graveyard of empires, and our long stay in Afghanistan culminated in a disastrous withdrawal. So what did we get wrong, and what should we have done?
So I did do a project that was run out of the Fletcher School at Tufts with two of my friends, Michael Cohen and Monica Duffy-Toft, and we looked at the mission in Afghanistan, and we organized our work around several core assumptions that guided or misguided that mission over 20 years. And our concern was, we stood it up about a year after the withdrawal because we were concerned that too much of the focus was going to be on August of 2021, and not enough focus was going to be on the prior 19 Augusts. Because it was a catastrophe that the United States sort of witnessed at the very tail end of that. But it was a catastrophe that was 20 years in the making. Yeah. And I will say this. I know there are some people that disagree with this, but I do believe that the decision to go after the al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan after the attacks on September 11th was the right decision. I think it was the right thing to do.
I do too.
And I think that it was not merely to dislodge al-Qaeda, which we did, but also to topple the Taliban and to send a message to other potential hosts of al-Qaeda or other transnational terrorist groups. Don't do this. This would end badly for you. But what we learned in our research is that there were numerous occasions as early as December of 2001, just within a few months of the war starting, where some within the Taliban, even some very senior people, were saying, we get it, we lost, we are prepared to accept the new political order in Afghanistan, and that those entreaties were repeatedly rebuffed. Now, the explanation was that because giving any quarter would take away from that message of, it wasn't just vengeance, but sending a message to others. But I think that was a terrible mistake, ultimately. I think that, in fact, telling the Taliban and those of their supporters, because they did have supporters and they still do, that say, you have two options. You can never have a say in the way this country is governed ever and again, or you can fight for it. And ultimately, they chose to fight for it. But that wasn't inevitable. And I think that was a terrible mistake. I also think, we had a brief discussion about aid. I do think that Afghanistan is one of the cautionary tales about what happens when a massive influx of Western assistance, it wasn't just the United States, is pumped into a desperately poor country that does not have the capacity to deal with those. It caused enormous disruption in the economy of Afghanistan, and I think that in ways that were ultimately very harmful. For perfectly understandable and defensible reasons, but the details matter, and it didn't work out very well.
Well, thank you, Chris. I'm going to ask one final question, and then you're going to get the really tough questions from our audience, and I'll ask Alex to come up here and moderate that. But so, Chris, what happens if Russia wins in Ukraine? And specifically, what is the impact on NATO and the EU?
So I think we need to be very clear about what we mean by win. What does it mean for the Russians to win in Ukraine?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Obviously, I think it's territorial control and control over their government, and not just a partial. I mean, something that is significant enough that Ukraine as a national entity is no longer functional.
Right. So that was, I think, quite clearly Vladimir Putin's intention in February of 2022, was he believed that in a matter of days or weeks tops, and again, many outsiders thought it was going to go that quickly as well, that he would topple the government in Kyiv and replace it with a friendly government that would tolerate the demands that he would put on them. That obviously didn't play out that way, and partly was because of U.S. and Western assistance, and including intelligence provided at critical moments in the early days of the war. But I'll say categorically, Mike, I don't think that Russia is going to win this. I don't think anybody is going to be able to code this as a win. What Russia has gained in the 3.5 years since the war started is, some territory in the eastern parts of Ukraine that were contested even before February of 2022. These were, there was fighting, low-level fighting going on there before. And I just don't think it is realistic to think that Russia is going to sweep across the rest of Ukraine if it hasn't been able to do so far. I also think that that what this has demonstrated, I think there is a shred of good news in this story, is that the Ukrainians' ability to resist this aggression, facing a much stronger adversary, demonstrates that other countries making similar investments, not under duress, but wise investments in advance of this, can also defend themselves very well. And I think that it will ultimately, to your question about NATO and the EU, it could actually create a situation where we have a stronger security order in Europe, precisely because the countries in Europe recognize their capacity to defend themselves from Russian aggression and not expect that they cannot do it without the United States being in the lead.
Well, thank you, Chris, and I'm going to turn it over to Alex now.
Thank you, Mike, for some phenomenal questions, and thank you, Chris, for wide-ranging and specific answers. And so we'll move to both at the same time, right? We'll move to the questions from the audience. Again, you can use the Q&A function if you're online watching. You can also use iaf@nmc.edu to email your questions, and then you'll see some volunteers circulating around with those question cards. So first one, this is from Aaron. It didn't say whether Aaron is here or watching online. The United Nations seems to have lost relevance. Do you think it's practical to rebuild it? And if yes, what would that look like?
Well, I think it's not merely practical, it's essential. I mean, getting from here to there is the hard part, but I think people have recognized that the structure of the United Nations, and in particular the Security Council, does not reflect the power realities in the world today. And so if you have an institution that is so disconnected from what is actually, exists, then it's going to lose relevance. It's going to be seen as less credible. I still believe that the institution is useful as a place where dialogue can take place, where problem solving can take place, but so long as the permanent five retain the veto and are able to use it even in a unilateral fashion, then I think that it's going to sort of descend further into irrelevance. One of the innovations that the Better Order Project talks about is the potential for some sort of a veto override in the event of a General Assembly vote, or even in the event of an expanded Security Council, 2 or more countries needing to exercise a no vote or a veto with a no vote in order to sustain it. Again, I think we shouldn't look past the enormous achievement that the United Nations was in the fall of 1945 and how much it has accomplished. But it was 80 years ago, and it needs a refresher.
Thank you. This one, the subject line of this question from online is, it's an old art question. They heard you were a historian, but not that type of historian. It's our group at the old art building. So given the way this administration has treated our allies, both inconsistent action on tariffs and cutting State Department and USAID funding, do you think the bonds can be repaired, and how?
Well, it's going to take work. There's no question about it. And I do think that the tariffs are completely nonsensical. They make no sense independent of whether or not we're levying them on allies and people who are not allies, countries that are not allies, indistinguishable. It doesn't make any sense. So that part I can't defend. I do think that there is an opportunity for U.S. allies to demonstrate, not merely to President Trump, excuse me, not merely President Trump, but to the rest of the American people, that the arrangement that we had for many, many years, where the United States was the principal provider of security and others were there merely in support, that bargain needs to change. And I think that this is a message that President Trump has sent repeatedly, and I think it's starting to sink in, and I think that's ultimately how we reimagine our alliances as being a more equitable arrangement, as opposed to where the United States is doing most of the heavy lifting.
This is sort of a follow-up on the allies questions. This is directly from the in-person audience to take you back to something you alluded to. Who are the 2 allies who are not serving our purposes? You alluded to 2 before.
Only 2? I think that one of the challenges of an organization like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is it conveys the sense that every single member of this alliance is equally important to every other member of the alliance. That's the premise of All for One and One for All, the Article 5 part of the NATO treaty. It's hard to sustain that argument. And it has become harder, it seems to me, over the course of the war in Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, was not a member of NATO, but the countries that are closest to Russia are those that are most concerned about Russian aggression, maybe another second or third round of Russian aggression, whereas those that are farther away from Russia aren't as interested. So it sort of reveals the fragility of this alliance that was sort of papered over because it wasn't really tested. So that's a concern I have. I also think that and this is not a new phenomenon. I think that when we have an alliance relationship, say, with Turkey, and at the same time we have an alliance relationship, or again, it's complicated, a security partnership with Israel, how does the United States adjudicate when Turkey and Israel are effectively if not at war with one another, it's not at war, but they're not very happy with one another, and so they have different interests. So how do we navigate that? So I think that I would not call out any one ally specifically, but I do think that that what I'm trying to emphasize, and my colleagues are trying to emphasize, is recognizing that these alliances do convey, or they're supposed to convey, common interests, and if they do not, how do we get them back on track? One other thing, just very quickly, for those of you who don't know it, before there was a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, there was something we now know as the Rio Pact. It's the treaty in Latin America, Central and South America. Mike knows it well, I'm sure. This predated NATO. It was the United States' first multilateral treaty organization, and we may discover that the United States is still a party to this treaty. We may discover that this becomes an issue for us if we, for example, go to war with Venezuela, which was a member and then wasn't a member and then was a member again and then isn't again, or Colombia, which is not very happy with us right now. Lo and behold, we have certain obligations under this treaty as well, and those are going to be exposed, I fear. I hope not, but I fear they will be over the next few months.
Thank you. Next question is from Harold, in-person question. What should the U.S. do about Taiwan now, and if China begins military operations? Wow.
They were the hard questions, Mike.
Yeah, I warned you.
You did warn me. I have one piece of good news as it pertains to Taiwan and China. Taiwan, being an island, is a hard country to conquer. It's not merely that it's an island and makes it hard to conquer, it's a very hard island to conquer. As someone who, I was in the Navy, I didn't have to storm beaches. Mike was responsible for storming the beaches. Amphibious operations are really, really hard. This operation would be the most difficult, the most complicated military operation probably in human history, okay? So there are many things that deter the Chinese from wanting to conquer Taiwan by force. What can the United States do to raise the threshold even higher? I think we can do a couple things. One is to remember that the agreement that we reached with Beijing, with China, at the beginning of our normalization, the Taiwan, the Shanghai communique and the four communiques and the other arrangements, were that the United States was respecting both, was not encouraging Taiwanese independence or a formal declaration of independence. I feel like the United States has appeared to move away from that in recent years, and I think that's a concern. So lower the temperature there. And then encourage the Taiwanese to make some smart investments in defensive technologies. I already alluded to these in terms of the way the Ukrainians have used defensive technologies. And encourage the Taiwanese to make some smart investments that take an extraordinarily difficult military problem and make it even more difficult. I think that's realistic and reasonable. But I come back to what I said at the very beginning. I think that sort of lowering the temperature with China on a range of issues, Taiwan has to be part of the lowering of the temperature. And a formal declaration of independence by the Taiwanese would be extraordinarily unsettling at this critical moment. So I hope that the Trump administration does not encourage that.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add before we get to the questions is I've traveled in my military career in China, and it seems like everybody from the senior most general and diplomat to the bus driver, that's the first thing they talk about is Taiwan.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting question from Drew in the audience here. Wondering what policymakers are paying attention to at Stimson. You know, as a senior fellow, you're representing Stimson Center tonight, and you know, what are the policymakers concerned about at Stimson? And where does their influence come?
I think that my colleagues and I are, all of us at Stimson, and frankly throughout the wider think tank community, we're concerned about the funding environment. We're concerned about cuts federal funding has affected us and others. So there's that. I think there's concern about how the perception that the Trump administration, we're a very internationally focused place. Many of my colleagues do work outside of the United States. In fact, arguably, our focus is more external to the United States than within the United States. How is that going to affect their ability to do their work? That's a concern for us. In terms of communicating with policymakers, we are a completely nonpartisan organization. We are very proud of that stance, and so therefore we are prepared to make policy recommendations regardless of who is in the White House or in positions of authority. So for us, it hasn't yet affected the way we do our work, but we've had to make some sort of, I think, strategic and decisions with respect to making sure that we can continue to do our work in the event that there are further disruptions down the road.
Thank you. This one is from Lou, and I think this will be maybe one of our last questions, and we'll give you a chance for closing remarks. It's titled Average Joe and Jane. So other than voting, what can we do as average Joes and Janes to change the direction of our failing international approach and stop/slow negative impacts on our international standing?
That's a great question. Somewhat selfishly, I think that supporting institutions that are committed to global engagement, to diplomacy, to crafting policies, not just U.S. government policies, but policies that allow us to continue to interact with people around the world. I think that's really critical. So this place, thank you all for being here. Thank you to IAF. It's precisely organizations like this that do help. I also think that members of Congress are getting calls and emails and messages all the time on a variety of things. They very rarely get calls or messages on foreign policy issues. Foreign policy is as the political scientists say, a very low salience issue. It does not move votes. It does not drive people to the ballot box. But there are moments in time when a member of Congress or a senator is responsible for making a critical decision on questions of war or peace, and that's when those phone calls can actually make a difference. And so I mentioned a few minutes ago that Senator Kaine from Virginia and Senator Paul from Kentucky and a few others attempted to bring forward a war powers resolution to limit the use of force against Venezuela. It was defeated on a mostly party line vote. I'm not aware of a groundswell of phone calls and whatnot to members of Congress, to the senators, and I think that we missed an opportunity there to make people, because the polling on this, we actually just got some briefing on polling today. American people recognize that they don't want the president to be starting wars willy-nilly. They believe that Congress actually should have a say. And so then I say, okay, if you believe that, then make sure your elected officials know that. Make sure that you expect them to honor their oath to the Constitution. And the Constitution says the war powers is vested in the Congress first and foremost. That would be a start.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mike. It's always lamentable to sort of wrap up the exploration, but we thank you for your insights, and I will leave a moment for some closing remarks after these messages. The messages are mostly of gratitude. I want to thank all of you supporting members, all of our business community members, the volunteers from our IAF advisory board, our student leadership team volunteers, the NMC Foundation team, the Dennos Museum Center team, our satellite partners in Leland and Rogers City, thank you. And all of you put this together. You help this community asset to thrive with your support right across northern Michigan. So thank you. Here's a quick preview of what's coming up next. November 5th, you can join us downtown at the State Theater Community Night. There's a documentary screening of He Named Me Malala. It's the story of Malala Yousafzai, Nobel Peace Prize winner. And you don't want to miss that because it leads directly into our following events the next week. The tickets are required for that State Theater Community Nights. You can check it out on the website. November 11th, we'll host a special Leadership Circle dinner with our invited guests for the week. We'll be at the Delamar Hotel. We'll have extra time with our speakers there in a beautiful setting, a beautiful evening. And then the next night, we'll welcome those distinguished guests to this stage. Ziauddin Yousafzai, the co-founder of the Malala Fund, educator and activist, and father of Nobel laureate Malala Yousafzai. And along with Ziauddin, Sue Gunawardena Vaughn, global lead for grant strategy at the Malala Fund. And those folks are committed to putting power and funding behind the fundamental truth that girls' education is the catalyst for global change. So you can find all the information at tciaf.com. So you can check out those events, grab tickets, make your membership gift for the season, and we appreciate all your support. Until we see you then, thank you, and I urge friends to join you next time. We'd like to keep filling. We have a beautiful auditorium here. We have a few empty seats we can fill. So spread the word. And now I would like to hand it over for any final words from our excellent honored guest, Chris Preble.
Well, thank you, Alex, again. And thanks to Mike for some really fantastic questions, as you saw. It's been a real pleasure to be here, my first visit to Traverse City. So I'm mostly just grateful for the opportunity, but really seriously, thank you all for coming out tonight. Thanks to you who are watching online. You could be doing lots of other things, hearing a comedian, for example, or something. And so I appreciate you taking, the interest that you show in this matters a lot, and I think that's the most important message I want to send. So thank you very much for your interest, and really appreciate it.
Until next time, thank you all for joining us.